All right, welcome into the second HoosierIllustrated.com Indiana football postgame wrap-up show, wrapping up Indiana's record-setting 77-3 victory over FCS Western Illinois. Kyler Staley with me as well, not from the stadium this time, but from the I don't know, what do we call your studio, Kyler? Because it's one of the more unique backgrounds that I always talk about, but we need a nickname for whenever you come to us from this particular setting.
This is Kyler's paradise. We'll just call it that until
Kyler's paradise. I like it. It's simple too.
Until I can think of a better name, or I get an actual studio. We are coming live from Fishers, Indiana, where I reside. So
I like it.
Yeah,
great game, obviously, from the Indiana Hoosiers in all facets. I mean, again, aside from a little hiccup at the end of the first half, very similar to what we saw during the second quarter of the FIU game. I mean, I hate to have a lack of criticism, but when you're playing an opponent like Western Illinois, I mean, there's not a lot of negative takeaways from this. And I even saw that from Kurt Cignetti whenever he was doing the post-game interview after the fact. I mean, he was very complimentary of his team and even said they had a nasty attitude about themselves in the second half, which is something that I don't want to say we've never seen from Indiana football, but I mean, this is clearly the defining statement of there is a new regime in town under Curt Cignetti, and he's left an early mark by breaking a couple of records for these Hoosiers here in his second game ever as the head football coach.
Man, I'll tell you what, the times have changed when it comes to Indiana football. I know the opponent aside, and you don't want to get caught up. You know, they were playing basically a JV team out there, if we're being brutally honest. And, you know, that's no disrespect to Western Illinois, but that's just kind of how it was with this game. So obviously, you know, Curt Cignetti was right. They did play with a nasty attitude. I thought the entire game, other than that little tiny hiccup where they let a field goal happen, they played with a chip on their shoulder in a lot of ways. And they proved that this is a different era of Indiana football in a lot of ways. You know, offensively, a lot of confidence on that end again, like we saw at FIU, a lot cleaner game on that end. I don't think they had any turnovers, if I can remember correctly.
They did not.
So that was just a clean win. The defense was stellar about 99% of the time throughout the game. You know, they were hawking the ball. They were, you know, going after, you know, the quarterback. I don't know how many sacks they ended up having but it felt like a ton. And honestly lost kind of count there. But
6 sacks, by the way. I'm looking at the stat sheet right now.
6 sacks. So just excellent there. You know, I thought the defensive line was really good. The linebacker core was really good. And obviously the secondary, they really did a good job of just shutting down their receivers and not letting a big play happen or anything like that. But, you know, a lot can come out of this game. Everyone stayed healthy for the most part that we know of, so that's good.
Other than James Bamba looked questionable. Obviously, He got carried off the game at one point. That was the one kind of scary moment. And there was also something that was, you know, a little, I don't want to say frightening, but there was a moment where Curtis Rourke kind of did something weird with his foot or his knee, and thankfully it wasn't anything to worry about. But that was early on or before we even got to halftime, and it kind of started making you wonder, like maybe bring in some backups a little early. And, you know, they ended up doing that eventually once they got a couple of drives into the third quarter. And speaking of which, you got reps from Taven Jackson. You saw some really good plays from him. He looked like a really confident backup, something that you don't always see from an IU backup specifically. You got to see snaps from Alberto Mendoza, kind of finding out that he's the third string quarterback when a lot of people kind of assumed it was Tyler Cherry. And I don't know if that was by design for tonight specifically, or if Alberto Mendoza really is the third guy behind Taven Jackson. But it was nice to see a bunch of dudes get reps tonight in a game. When we said that last week, Kyler, that it was really important for Indiana to stay healthy and put yourself in a position where you get to the third quarter and you can put these guys in for these types of reps.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's what all this, you know, this type of game is really about, is you want to get the younger guys reps. And sticking with Taven Jackson, even though it was a small sample size, man, he looked much more improved than what we saw last season. You can tell that he's really put in work, and I love the way that they were using him. You know, that trick play really threw everyone off. It threw the camera off, you know, whatever. It threw me off watching the running back. Then obviously he sneaks in on the side there for a touchdown. But he was stepping up, making confident throws. I kind of wish you would have saw a little bit more of him, but you also got to realize, you know, he is the backup for this team, so you want to keep him healthy for the most part. You don't want to let anything happen, you know, in this type of game. So just in case, you know, something happens with Curtis Rourke, you got Taven Jackson in your back pocket. But Once again, you saw the skill guys, the running back core, the wide receiver group just showed how deep they are as a unit, on, both units there. Just throwing guys left and right. And it's just really impressive. It's only 2 games in, but I am so impressed with the wide receiver core, just because there's so many weapons that you can throw out there. And Curtis Rourke, confident, experienced, high IQ quarterback. He's going to have, a lot of options to work with. And then I thought the offensive line played really, really good as well. So, it's an excellent performance. It's a get right game in a lot of ways. That they cleaned up a lot. I don't think they had very many penalties, if I can remember correctly. But both sides of the ball were really good and really dominant in this game, and that's exactly what it needed to be.
You mentioned the wide receiver room, 8 different people caught a pass, and that includes tight ends as well. Elijah Surratt, 6 receptions. Omar Cooper, 4 receptions. Anderson Kobe had a reception, and all the first 3 guys I named all had a touchdown. Miles Price had 4 catches, and then a catch each from Solomon Van Horst, Keyshawn Williams, Brady Simmons, and then James Bamba, who we mentioned earlier, ended up being helped off the field at one point during the game. I mentioned a couple of records that were broken, just in case you're unaware. One of them was a points record. Indiana scored 77 points. The previous record was 76, set back in the year 1901, played against Franklin College. So, and I heard somebody say on the BTM broadcast, I think they said 44,033 days, something along those lines. Either way, whatever the exact number is, that's insane. Obviously, there are no human beings alive who lived to see that 76 point victor, or 76 points scored for the Indiana Hoosiers back at the beginning of the 1900s. So a whole new face of Indiana football fans, I guess, got to take that in the night. Also set a record for offensive yardage, got 701 yards of total offense, which, again, we haven't seen numbers even close to that since the Kevin Wilson era, when it seemed like that was at least, kind of the norm. And the last time Indiana even came close to breaking that points record was back when they faced Indiana State in 2013. They won that game 73-35. The biggest difference here, first of all, they were both against FCS opponents, but you held this particular FCS opponent to only 3 points. So, and again, we're comparing apples to oranges here, but at the same time, it's a really good sign, especially when you think defensively the difference with this style of football team compared to whenever we saw the high-powered offenses of the Kevin Wilson era back in the early 2010s.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, especially in the second half, I just kept thinking to myself, like, man, this would be a totally different game if we still had Walt Bell and, he had Tom Allen at the game. It would probably be a dominant win. Western Illinois is just a really, really bad team. Obviously haven't won the games in it was like 20-something straight games.
2000. Well, someone said 2018. I don't know if that's true, but somebody told me 2018 is the last time Western Illinois won a football game.
It might as well be. So we can fact check that. But I just think that, going back to last year and stuff, in this type of game, I think the offense would have been very timid. I don't think the playbook would have been opened up like it was today. And I think it'd be kind of a closer game, probably like a 30-0 type of game or whatever.
Yeah.
Not a 77 blowout there. But, there's just a lot of good takeaways, with this game and just, what you saw from Indiana. Obviously the big game is next weekend. It's UCLA. Yeah. So it's going to be a completely different mindset. You're not going to see them put up 77 points, like that or whatever. But from what you see out of this Indiana team, there's a lot of confidence in this team, a lot of confidence in the program. And I think that they have that confidence where, them going on the road, going out to the West Coast and playing a Big Ten opponent, I don't think that's going to intimidate them at all. I think this team is experienced. They got skilled players. They got talent, all across the board, to where they can go in. And I guess you would call it a road upset in a lot of ways. So they have that legit chance. Cignetti in his second game, opponent aside, a second game is already setting records for this Indiana team. So I think Indiana does have their guy in that. So I speak to all the Hoosier Nation. I think it's time for them to buy in with this guy, because this is a completely different Indiana football team, Indiana program that you have not seen in a long, long time.
Matt asks, is Sig the real deal? And I think you just answered that right there. I mean, if you haven't bought in yet, obviously a lot of people want to see them do something against a real opponent, and they're going to get an opportunity with UCLA next week. And I bet Deshaun Foster, Kyler, I bet he's shaking in his boots right now, because UCLA, they're not playing him this week. I'm sure he had his eyes glued to Indiana versus Western Illinois tonight just to see what the Hoosiers might be made of. And again, we've talked kind of about his demeanor and the way that he kind of carries himself a little timidly. And obviously, Kurt Cignetti is the exact opposite when it comes to the way that he carries himself. And if their attitudes are reflective of their respective teams, I don't want to go in there and say Indiana's going to dominate UCLA. I don't feel comfortable just throwing something like that out there. But if the confidence from tonight carries over to next week on the West Coast, I expect Indiana to find a way to come away with a victory and return home with a nice Big Ten W before you face Charlotte in week 4.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the last time we saw UCLA, they were struggling against Hawaii. So,
Yep.
you know,
and they're off this week, which is a very weird kind of situation to be in this early in the season.
Very, very weird. You know, yeah, very early in the season, you get a bye week. It's just kind of weird, and that's kind of hard to adjust. So they're basically, you know, restarting their season once again, going into next season. So just a weird type of 2 weeks. You know, they're in a different mindset. So, but Indiana's got a lot of reps in, and obviously for UCLA, this was definitely a game that they could scout all the way through. They could see a lot of different things, and I don't think you saw all of Indiana's playbook. But it opened up a lot today. So obviously they're going to have that to work with and everything. They have a lot more film to work with versus what Indiana doesn't have a whole lot of film to work with the UCLA. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely arguably the most important game on this Indiana schedule, because if they were to win this game, I think this team is probably making a really, I wouldn't say deep run, but they're definitely going to win a lot more games, and they're going to become bowl eligible. I think that's the goal this year. I think it's very doable for this team. And Cignetti, he's the right guy for this, and he's leading them, and he has definitely built this program up in a way that we have not seen in a long, long time.
Eric says he's watched Indiana football since the Randall L era, and he hasn't seen a coach be so disciplined and it shows in all 3 aspects of the game. I mean, again, Kyler, I don't know how much of the broadcast you got to take in tonight, but both Jay Lehman and Lisa Byington continually were talking about the way that Cignetti, he just has this stoic look throughout really the entirety of the game. He's got his hands on his hips. I mean, there were obviously last week in the opener, there were a lot of faces that kind of became memes for the week for Indiana football. And I think that's just going to continue throughout his tenure at Indiana, because he sticks to his brand. He knows who he is. Obviously, he's been around a long time. He's in his early 60s. He's not going to change his personality for anybody. And who he is exactly who he's going to be through and through as the head football coach for the Hoosiers. And it's entertaining. It's a breath of fresh air because, again, it's the antithesis of what we got with Tom Allen. And not that there's anything wrong with the way Tom Allen carried himself, because obviously that for a while was a very contagious attitude during the most successful times of him being at Indiana. But it's just interesting seeing a new take on a different type of an attitude and the way that it's kind of becoming this new brand of Indiana football.
Yeah, I mean, you're comparing Cignetti and Tom Allen. They definitely are very passionate about football, but they show it in a lot of different ways. I think Cignetti obviously is very, very locked in. He doesn't like mistakes at all. He will not tolerate mistakes. And you could tell basically when they went into halftime, he was not happy about them letting up 3 points. He wanted a shutout, and I think Indiana probably should have got that. But that's just something, you know, they're not perfect at that. They obviously need to show that they can play and they can close out a half or whatever. So that's something for the defense to work on, and proves that they are not perfect and by any stretch of the means. So Cignetti, he's just a guy that's really just going to, you know, bring this Indiana team together in a lot of ways. And I think they talked about it, and I'm probably butchering this a little bit, but I think they talked about how Cignetti wants his words to carry a little bit more weight. So he doesn't really talk to the team throughout the week or whatever. So when he does speak to him, he's serious, and he wants them to really, you know, buy into what he is saying to them, which I think is a very good, interesting approach for a head coach or whatnot. So you can just tell there's a lot of confidence with this team, a lot of confidence, and you just really, really enjoy watching them in a lot of ways. So I think Indiana fans are really going to enjoy watching them if they can go into UCLA and then get a big win there.
Jackson says, have what we have seen in the first 2 games changed the ceiling for the Hoosiers? Kyler, I think you kind of hit on that a moment ago when you kind of mentioned expectations. When you think about the beginning of the season, we talked about how kind of getting to that bowl game was the bare minimum. I think that's still, I mean, obviously we have the 2-game sample size is very small. And again, it's hard not to overreact after what we saw, even though this is an FCS opponent. But I do think it's easy for me to say still that there's no reason that this team shouldn't find a way into the postseason with what we've seen so far and the way they kind of carry themselves.
Yeah, and then you also parlay that in with their schedule. Very,
Yeah.
very winnable schedule. We talked a lot with that. Obviously, it gets really difficult when you have back-to-back Ohio State and Michigan down the road, but that's
Yeah.
way down the road, and that's towards the end of the season. I think that's within the final 3 weeks of the season or somewhere around there. So
all three teams that Cignetti called out when he was in Assembly Hall, they play him back-to-back. Well, not exactly back-to-back because there is a bye week in between, but you have Michigan and Ohio State and Purdue as your final 3 games of the season.
Yeah, so that's definitely going to be target practice in a lot of ways for those teams. So they're definitely going to have those on the locker room boards and all that stuff. So, but yeah, back to the schedule. Obviously, it's very favorable. There's a good chance if Indiana were to go on the road and beat UCLA. They got Charlotte, so you probably start there 4-0, and then after that, tougher games. Obviously, you get really into the teeth of the Big Ten, but very favorable, especially with just the talent that Indiana has and the experience that I think a lot of the players have on this. Plus, Cignetti's record, never have a losing season or whatnot and everything. So I think it's just a perfect storm in a lot of ways for this team to obviously be bowl eligible. And I do think the ceiling has kind of risen just a little bit. So I know when you and I talked and we previewed this, heading into the season, both you and I agreed maybe 8 wins was probably the highest that you can get to there. I still think 8 wins is probably doable. Yeah. And I think that's probably the most that you would get out of this Indiana team this season. But we'll just have to see, kind of wait and see or whatever. So obviously the real test is next week. And I know Indiana fans are really, really looking forward to that.
Yeah, honestly, I don't want to say this game means nothing, but it means a whole lot less if you find a way to lay an egg against UCLA. And I know it's going to be very difficult regardless, simply because of the fact that you're going to be on the West Coast. It's going to be something you've never done before, or at least you haven't been to the Rose Bowl since the 60s. Yeah. But I know Cignetti, and anybody who's listened to him enough knows this, he's not going to take anything as an excuse. They're going to attack every game the same. I believe he uses the term faceless opponent, something along those lines. So as we wrap this thing up, that's kind of what we're moving into next, is just, can Indiana really take another step forward next week with UCLA and really show the football world on a national stage? You'll be on NBC at 7 p.m. on Saturday, prime time. And again, it won't be the most popular game of choice, even though it is on prime time. It will be on a national network. It's still going to be an opportunity in front of a national audience to show that Indiana is something a whole lot different than what the casual people, and I say casual, I mean fans of other teams that don't watch Indiana football, what they're used to seeing from teams out of Bloomington.
Yeah, and obviously I think this is big for just the fan base in general. I think if they go in there, beat UCLA, I think the fans that have been a little hesitant to really support this football program, the ones that aren't shown to the game, going to the games or whatever, and the ones that are, packing the stadium, I think if they go in there and they're able to beat UCLA, I think people are going to kind of wake up in a lot of ways as well. And they're going to get on this bandwagon that Cignetti.
You may see, and maybe not against Charlotte, but come week 5 against Maryland, you may see a sold-out Memorial Stadium potentially.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously you go down the road, if Indiana happens to be undefeated going into their homecoming game against Nebraska, I mean, that might be one of the biggest sellouts that Memorial Stadium's seen in a long time. So,
and that's something it goes back to our preview on the Talking About the Hoosiers podcast. I know we kind of tongue-in-cheek, I mean, not completely jokingly, I know I mentioned it because I knew that there was a pathway to get there, but if both Indiana and Nebraska find themselves at, I think it would be both 6-0 at that point, if I'm not mistaken. Again, the environment you're going to have homecoming weekend. It's also the same weekend as Hoosier Hysteria. Obviously, the big name in general with Nebraska being in town. And I know we're getting way ahead of ourselves, but we are allowed to do that because we're not the actual players on the football team. Yeah, it's fun to just kind of imagine what if and think about those scenarios, because football might actually be fun again in Bloomington for the first time since the 2020 season. And I don't know about you, Kyler, but I'm excited to see what happens next week.
There's a lot of excitement, pretty anxious to see what Indiana can do next week. Obviously got to have a really good week of practice. Cignetti's got to get them ready. They really need to enjoy this win a little bit tonight as well, because they put on a really, really good performance. And, opponent aside, it was Western Illinois, not a very good team, not a very good program right now, but just the stuff that they were doing on the field, I think they should be really, really proud of themselves, what they did tonight. And obviously setting a record, multiple records tonight, that's just huge. And that's definitely worth celebrating. But big test is next week, UCLA at UCLA. We just got to kind of see what this Indiana team's about, and obviously if they're going to continue to live up to the hype that they have kind of placed on themselves. So we will definitely see.
And one last thing to keep an eye on that we have not mentioned, we had no Donovan McCulley tonight. Hoping to see him back in action next week. We talked earlier, Kyler, I believe it was last week, that it was probably the safe move no matter what to keep Donovan McCulley off the field this week, because you didn't want to further aggravate whatever that injury was and potentially have him ready for a much more important opponent. So again, all this happened without your top wide receiver again on the roster tonight. So,
but I will add to this before we
go ahead
off here and everything. But Elijah Sarrett, I mean, he was excellent tonight, and he showed why he was one of the top wide receiver transfers out there, and played really good. He stepped up as that kind of number one wide receiver and everything. But you mentioned it. There was no reason to play Donovan McCulley. I think he's going to be okay, but he comes next week or whatever. But this was definitely a precaution thing. No need to play him or whatever. And I'm curious to see if we will see EJ Williams as well. He has been out both games, and obviously he's fought a lot of injuries, over the past few years that he's been with Indiana. So if they're able to get him, and you've seen when he is on the field, he's a very talented wide receiver. So if you are to get him, that's just another weapon to that wide receiver core that Curtis can work with.
Good stuff. Thank you, everybody who tuned in to our live production, if that's what you want to call this, of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show. Appreciate all the comments coming through on YouTube. And one thing, I forgot to mention this once again, Kyler. If you want to leave us a call, and again, maybe this is something that I'll just have to abandon down the line, because maybe this is an old school way. I still love it. I use it for my other podcast, Out of Touch. But it's the hotline number, 502-830-9195. You can leave a message that we can either play on here. I can play it on In Touch with Indiana Sports on Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays. But share any of the thoughts that you may have for Indiana football, basketball, any of that good stuff. And we'll put you on one of our shows and, react to whatever it is you have to comment on, that type of thing. But until next week, Kyler, appreciate you coming on with me as always. Enjoy this, and hopefully looking forward to, another good conversation next week.
Yes, sir.
All right. Until then, this has been another episode or another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show.